Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you today. Some of you know I work at the Lighthouse Rescue Mission in Nampa, and I'm there in the Learning Center. And one morning, there was a man who came through the door, had a piece of paper in his hand, and he gave it to me, asked me to read it. He was a school teacher, and this was something that had always meant a lot to him, so I'm going to share some of this with you. As she stood in the front of her 5th grade class on the very first day of school, she told the children an untruth. Like most teachers, she looked at her students and said that she loved them all the same. However, that was impossible because there in the front row, slumped in his seat, was a little boy named Teddy Stoddard. Mrs. Thompson had watched Teddy the year before and noticed that he did not play well with the other children, that his clothes were messy, and that he constantly needed a bath. In addition, Teddy could be unpleasant. It got to the point where Mrs. Thompson would actually take delight in marking his papers with a broad red pen, making bold X's, and then putting a big F at the top of his papers. At the school where Mrs. Thompson taught, she was required to review each child's past records, and she put Teddy's off until last. However, when she reviewed his file, she was in for a surprise. I'm just going to cut to the chase here. Basically, she opens up the file, she reads through it, she realizes that a couple years prior, Teddy's mother has died of cancer, and ever since, his behavior at the school has gotten worse and worse. Now, just out of my own curiosity, by a show of hands, how many of you have heard this story before? For the benefit of those of you who have not, Christmas rolls around, he brings in a little gift wrapped in brown paper from a grocery sack. It has a rhinestone bracelet in it with a couple of rhinestones missing and some perfume that had belonged to his mother. Before long, Mrs. Thompson becomes the best teacher that Teddy ever had. It changes his life. And regularly he will write letters over the years. He graduates from high school and then from college, and then, believe it or not, from medical school, and finally he invites Mrs. Thompson to his wedding. Now, maybe it's the skeptic in me, but I've always believed that if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is, especially the part where Teddy Stoddard gets a wing of a hospital named after him. It took all of 30 seconds on the internet to tell me what I already suspected, and that was the story was not true. It had never happened. And I felt an obligation to tell this man so. And when I did, his jaw dropped. He sat there for the longest time, did not say a word. He just stared at me. And the longer he stared at me, the more I felt like a total jerk. The truth is that author Elizabeth Ballard wrote a little story that was called 3 Letters from Teddy. It was published in a Baptist Sunday school paper called Home Life. They interviewed her years later, and the story obviously has circulated countless times, and Ballard said, "I've had people use it in their books, except they made it as if it happened to them." I think it's absolutely wrong to do that. Do teachers change lives? Of course they do. But there's no sense believing a story is true when it's not. Sometimes we may need reminded that even if something makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And the flip side is that even if it makes us feel bad or uncomfortable or guilty, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's false either. The truth matters. Just so you don't get the wrong idea, my spiritual gift is not to go around bursting bubbles and pulling rugs out from under other people. That's not the point. That's not what God has called me to do. But the point is, as Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, every human being has a choice between truth and repose. Take which you please. You cannot have both. I firmly believe that. What is repose? We have a choice between truth and repose. Repose is peace and quiet. It's an attitude that says ignorance is bliss. To put that another way, there's the blue pill and there's the red pill. And you have a choice to make between illusion on the one hand and reality on the other. And sometimes that reality is very painful. Christians talk a whole lot about faith. It might be helpful to keep in mind that a synonym for the word faith is trust. Why it matters that you believe, that you put faith in, that you trust in what is true, is because to not do so inevitably leads to disappointment and to disillusionment, having our illusions shattered as a result. The message of the Bible is that loving the wrong things will lead to a broken heart. Besides, it's not things that matter, but loving God and loving the people that He made. That's what matters. That's what's true. The origin of the word belief comes from an earlier word that had to do with to love. Faith is not so much in correct doctrine, although don't misunderstand, correct doctrine is very important. But faith or trust or belief has to do with loving the right person, who is God. God who is Himself the way and the truth and the life. Now the following is a true story. It took place only hours before Jesus was to be cruelly tortured and then executed. But even then, even as Jesus was staring death in the face, what still mattered to Him more than anything else was the truth. John 18, verse 28. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death He was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked Him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Do you think I am a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priest who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I'm a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him, but it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. Discerning the truth is especially important when it comes to Jesus. His life, His death, what it all meant. We could say it's absolutely crucial. Literally, that word means cross-shaped. There's the image of a signpost, signs pointing two different directions. Again, truth requires us to make a choice. We have to separate fact from fiction. What's going on in this passage, though, illustrates that not everyone made a priority of the truth. Let's take a closer look. First of all, we need to realize that truth matters more than religious tradition and religious ritual. The scribes had written long before that the dwelling places of Gentiles are unclean. So these religious authorities were already a little reluctant to go into the palace. But especially now, because this was Passover. There's an important tradition during the Passover celebration. You have to go through the house, searching high and low, making sure you find every bit of leaven and getting rid of it. Entering Pilate's headquarters at that time meant running the risk of coming into contact with leaven. And that in turn would mean they would be unclean for 7 days, and they would miss the feast entirely. There are several profound ironies throughout this passage in John, and this is one. The religious leaders themselves are seeking to avoid defilement in order to keep the Passover. And yet the greatest Passover of all was about to be accomplished. In the past, as you know, God had sent a deliverer in Moses. He was to set his people free from Egyptian slavery. The people were commanded that night to take sacrificial lambs and to take their blood and spread it on the doorposts. Moses would lead them to the Red Sea. The sea would be parted. They'd go into the wilderness and eventually into the Promised Land. The Passover celebration was an annual observance, a remembrance of those events. The amazing thing is that Jesus would now become both the deliverer and the sacrificial lamb. His own self-sacrifice, his body, and the blood of that sacrificial lamb would set people free from slavery to sin. And we commemorate that this morning with the bread and with the wine on this first day of the week. As Paul said, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Acknowledging that, just as we sang this morning, God with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, has delivered his people. It's exactly what he did in Jesus in a way that Moses could never accomplish. He has set us free. He has given us life. Notice that it was religious tradition and ritual that had been the biggest obstacle that prevented people from hearing what Jesus had to say, from really recognizing his voice throughout his entire ministry. I appreciate so much how Steve has walked us through the Sermon on the Mount. And there in that sermon, there's one of the greatest promises of all. Jesus says very plainly, "Seek and you will find." And as Steve has shared with us, that verb is ongoing action. It's something you do continually. Keep on seeking and asking and knocking, and the promise you will find. Because the truth matters more than anything, we ought not allow religious tradition or habit or ritual to blind us to it. We've got to keep seeking that truth. Eugene Peterson translates the verse this way. He says, "I was born and entered the world so that I could witness to the truth." Now notice this. Everyone who cares for the truth, who has any feeling for the truth, recognizes my voice. If you consider for a moment the implications of that statement, what Jesus is saying about all other religious teaching, he says his words are the very standard by which all of them are compared and measured. It is an amazing truth, but what Jesus is claiming right here is that listening to his words means listening to the very voice of God. The truth matters. The truth matters more than achievements and success and power. The Roman emperor was the one who would choose a procurator to rule in Palestine. And ordinarily, when a procurator was assigned a territory, he would enter that place with a detachment of soldiers. And the soldiers at the front would be carrying the Roman standards, these huge banners up on poles. At the very top of that pole would be a little metal bust of the emperor. Now, as far as the Jews were concerned, they understood that the Romans looked upon their emperor as a god himself. And so that little metal bust on the top of those flags was itself a graven image. It violated the first commandment. The previous procurators of Palestine were wise enough to understand that, and so they had them removed before they came into Jerusalem. Except Pilate did not. Instead, Pilate had his soldiers march in with the metal images of the emperor proudly displayed for all to see. The Jews then requested that he remove them. He refused. They kept at it. For most of a week, they nagged Pilate. They pleaded with Pilate to remove those images, and he still would not. Finally, in exasperation, what Pilate told them, he said, "If all of you will meet me in the amphitheater, we'll discuss this further." And as you might well imagine, as they got in there, he surrounded them with his armed soldiers, and he warned them if they did not give up their demands, he would have all of them beheaded. And at that point, the Jews bared their necks, and they told the soldiers to proceed. Pilate lost that one. He let the Jews go free, and he had a major strike against him in the eyes of Rome. One of the things that's going on here then, Pilate understands that if there's any more trouble in Palestine, and Pilate is the one who is responsible, most likely he will lose his job. Getting in good with the Roman establishment then is what matters to him most, much more so than any lofty concerns about truth. Throughout their history, the Israelites proudly claimed they had no king but God. But here there seems to be a dramatic shift in allegiance. Because here it is, they say, we have no king but Caesar. And if you continue reading in the next chapter, what you find is there's somewhat of a veiled threat. Because they warn Pilate, they say, if you let this man go, in other words, if you do not give us permission to execute Jesus, you are no friend of Caesar. And Pilate understands exactly what that means. But the fact is, truth has got to matter more than anything that this world has to offer. Seeking truth is a matter of seeing the forest in spite of the trees. It's maintaining perspective, ignoring for a moment what is urgent in favor of what is most important. In fact, what is essential. For 21st century American Christians, I believe it's a matter of laying aside our busyness for a time, our desire for achievement and for success, and focusing on what truly matters most. This happened 20 years ago, but I still vividly recall. We made a trip to the grocery store, and this is one of those once-a-month excursions when, you fill up the whole back of the car. I must have had 20 bags of groceries. And we got home, and, I was making trips to and fro, carrying the bags, setting them on the kitchen counter. And as I did so, I was making sort of a mental inventory. Made sure I had, the baby back ribs were there, microwave popcorn, check, Twinkies, check. I had all the good stuff, and so, once I had brought in every one of the bags, I sat down in the recliner and congratulated myself on a job well done. But I had this uncomfortable feeling. And after a few minutes, I realized it was quiet. It was too quiet. I made one last trip out to the car, and there was Max in his car seat, big tears rolling down his cheeks. And yeah, I know, that's how I felt. Something is terribly wrong when I'm breaking the speed limit to make sure the ice cream doesn't melt, and yet my own flesh and blood is still there in the car. I sort of overlooked, what matters most. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Not losing sight of what matters most of all. Do you realize that one of the most amazing aspects of this passage in John is that Jesus, he knows full well his death is merely hours away, and yet he still cares about Pilate. He cares about Pilate, of all people, more so than defending himself, more so than seeking an acquittal, begging for mercy, looking for an 11th hour stay of execution. Jesus is the one pleading with Pilate for Pilate to make his own sort of deathbed conversion by finally admitting to the truth when he sees it. And yet Jesus is the one who is about to die. He's calmly, courageously explaining to him that truth is why he came into the world, and that truth was, in a very real way, then and there, live and in person. And yet, how does Pilate respond? He says, "What is truth?" Do we know for sure his attitude? The tone of his voice? No. I believe he turned a deaf ear to Jesus. I believe he had a stubborn heart. He didn't wait around to listen for an answer. What mattered to Pilate was staying in the good graces of Rome. I think there was a hint of sarcasm there, of mockery. And reading over Pilate's situation, it reminded me of one of my favorite books of all time. It's called The Screwtape Letters. I know some of you are familiar with this. It's a book by C.S. Lewis. It's a unique collection of correspondence between a senior devil named Screwtape and his underling and nephew Wormwood. Now, Wormwood is a junior tempter in training. He needs advice on how best to lead his assigned human astray. And everything in the letters, as you read through them, is backwards in a sense. Sort of a demonic, bizarro world that they live in. Screwtape is glad that the human that Wormwood has made friends with, or seeks to tempt in this way, that these friends of his are steady, consistent scoffers and worldlings who, without any spectacular crimes, are progressing quietly and comfortably towards our Father's house. And by that, of course, he's not referring to God. And again in this particular letter, he refers to the word flippancy. Flippancy is sort of an old-fashioned word. It's sort of this attitude that everything is a joke. You know, the age-old question, is nothing sacred? The flippant person would say, duh, no, nothing is sacred. When all is said and done, ultimately nothing matters. And it's very similar to the attitude that so many have about truth. Does truth even exist? Is there such a thing as an absolute, as something real, as something that is true? Consider that when Screwtape writes to Wormwood and says this about flippancy. Only a clever human can make a real joke about virtue, or indeed about anything else. Any of them can be trained to talk as if virtue were funny. Among flippant people, the joke is always assumed to have been made. No one actually makes it, but every serious subject is discussed in a manner which implies that they have already found a ridiculous side to it. If prolonged, the habit of flippancy builds up around a man the finest armor plating against the enemy that I know. And for Screwtape, of course, God was the enemy. I have no idea what Pilate's heart was like on that day. I believe he may have been quite flippant when he asked, "What is truth?" I do know that with people today, so often that attitude towards truth, it's as if it is a joke that's already been made. That attitude will insulate you from the truth more effectively than practically anything else. Truth matters more than popularity. Very shortly, Jesus will be beaten. The soldiers will mockingly make Jesus out to be a king. They'll place a crown of thorns on his head. After that, it says they enter to a place that's called the stone pavement, and there's the judge's seat. Now, the Greek word there can be interpreted a couple of different ways. Traditionally, we think of Pilate taking on that judgment seat. That's his accustomed spot. But the ancient Christian theologian Justin Martyr says Pilate actually made Jesus sit in that seat out of mockery. And yet, just as they made fun of Jesus as a king and as a judge, we do know that he was in fact both. You get the sense throughout this whole scene that it was not Jesus on trial at all, so much as it was the entire world. Jesus, in a sense, belonged on that judgment seat, and one day he will judge this world. And yet those who are his followers, those who have put their trust, their faith in Jesus, have already been declared not guilty. That's the wonderful promise that we find in the gospel. When we get to the last verse of chapter 18, the crowds are asking for Barabbas. The son of the Father is what his name literally means. He was a resistance fighter. You might even think of him as a first century terrorist, in fact. And that's who they're demanding, not this Jesus. Again, we need reminded that truth is not determined by popularity. If there'd been an exit poll, then obviously Barabbas was the people's choice. Once and for all, tragically, what they are doing is rejecting the true Son of the Father in favor of Barabbas. The popular vote is not always the right one. Truth is always truth, no matter what the survey says. Last but certainly not least, truth matters even more than life itself. Jesus said, "For this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth." There is a reminder here that Jesus existed long before his birth. He has, in fact, existed for all time because Jesus is the Son of God. That's the truth that he was testifying to. As he said in John 8, "Before Abraham was, I am," taking on the very name of God for himself. And yet here is the king and the judge of the entire universe, and he's about to take the place of a condemned man, showing that the truth does matter most, even more so than life itself. It had to be the case that Jesus was crucified. Traditionally, in the Mosaic law, if someone blasphemed against God, there was one punishment, and that was to be stoned to death. And yet Jesus, looking ahead throughout his ministry to his death, he would refer to being lifted up and to his word being fulfilled. And what he had in mind the entire time was that, as it says in Deuteronomy, "Cursed is everyone who hangs upon a tree." He knew that he had to be crucified because as he was on that cross, he became for us our punishment. In fact, our curse. He took that upon himself as a condemned man. Last month we observed a 100-year anniversary of a tragic event. Most of you know, in April of 2012, the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank. Just last hour, many of you know Frank York. Frank came up to me afterwards and he said that his grandfather's sister had actually been on the Titanic, was one of those who had drowned. It was a terrible tragedy, thousands of lives lost. On that April 12th, there was another time when choices had to be made. Several people proved themselves to be heroes, while several also proved themselves to be cowards. One of those heroes was a man who was named Thomas Andrews. Late that night, Andrews had been in his stateroom, and at first he didn't even realize that the ship had hit an iceberg. Once it dawned on him, what he did was, well, he didn't panic. He didn't immediately board one of the lifeboats. Instead, what Andrews did was to do a room-to-room search. He would knock on the door. He would tell the passengers they needed to put on their life belts. They needed to get on the deck. And once on the deck, he urged people to climb into what few lifeboats there were available. In spite of their great reluctance, passengers even then had no idea just how serious the situation was. But Andrews did know. In fact, when he was told what had happened, he knew within a moment that they had less than an hour. The reason he knew that is because Andrews was the architect of the Titanic. It was in his stateroom. He was going over the drawings of that ship, planning improvements to make for the next time. But of course, for him, there would not be a next time. He stayed behind, and because he did, he was unable to rescue himself, and his body was never recovered. After days of waiting, his family finally received a telegram back home in Ireland. This is what it said. Interview, Titanic's officers, all unanimous that Andrew's heroic unto death, thinking only safety, others, extend heartfelt sympathy to all. A stewardess on the Titanic, Mary Sloan, was one of those that Andrews had persuaded to finally enter a lifeboat. Many years later, she wrote a letter and she said this: Mr. Andrews met his fate like a true hero, realizing the great danger, and gave up his life to save the women and children of the Titanic. They will find it hard to replace him. No doubt you are already way ahead of me. And you know that according to the Gospel of John, Jesus himself is the architect of the universe. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And yet, this same maker of all things, this creator, also willingly sacrificed himself for the sake of the ones that he created, so that they could live. In Jesus' own words, greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. It is that sacrifice that demonstrates the Son of God, who is himself the way and the truth and the life. That sacrifice we celebrate this morning on this first day of the week as we once again break bread together. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, dear God, to you be all glory and praise and honor. And we are humbled, our Father, by that terrible price that Jesus paid. But we acknowledge that he accomplished something that no other could. But by laying down his life, by becoming that Passover lamb, he is able once and for all to liberate, to set free all of us from sin. Thank you, God, for that tremendous privilege. We do again give you thanks for the truth. And all this we pray in his precious and his holy name. Amen.